Hello, CSW members and CSWE members, and welcome to this webinar that's titled A Space for Race. I'm Sally Guy. I'm the Director of Policy at the Canadian Association of Social Workers, and I'm delighted to be moderating this event with Dr. Kathy Hogarth. So before I actually introduce our speaker, though, a couple housekeeping details to cover, if any of you are new in the audience especially. So information on what to do if your screen freezes, how to get a certificate of attendance, where to download the slide deck, where to access Kathy's book, for instance, all of that is written down in the welcome widget. It should have popped up when you first logged in to the presentation, but if you don't see it, you can access it and other helpful widgets by clicking those colorful little icons at the bottom of your screen. Also, if you're new, this window that you see in front of you is totally customizable, so you can make any of the windows smaller or bigger the way that you would by dragging on a normal Windows screen. I also wanted to flag that our presenter, Kathy, is going to be asking you to reflect and sort of share throughout the presentation. So we are going to have a formal question and answer period at the end. So please do type in your questions whenever they occur to you, or even your stories or your reflections. But I also hope to be able to potentially share some of your, the audience's reflections and thoughts throughout the presentation, maybe too. So basically, don't be shy typing them in whenever. So with that, on to actually introducing our speaker. Dr. Kathy Hogarth is a professor in the School of Social Work at Renison University College at the University of Waterloo. But prior to becoming an academic, Dr. Hogarth was a counselor at the University of Technology in Jamaica. Since she came to Canada in 2002, she's been involved in community-based research, primarily with marginalized populations in Canada. And her work with these populations was really furthered through her dissertation research documenting the experience of racialized immigrants, especially women, and their attempts at negotiating belonging in Canada. And so before I actually pass it over to Kathy for her formal part of the presentation, we just wanted to get to know the audience a little bit better. So I've popped up on your screen here a quick little poll to say who you are. Frontline practitioner, if you're in middle management, senior management, private practice, student, academic. We just want a sense of sort of who's here, so that can help, I think, probably Kathy better tailor some of her content today. Give you a couple seconds there. All right, we're getting good responses. All right, so that's pretty clear. We have most of all of you are frontline practitioners. We have a couple students and a couple academics. So I think that's some pretty good info to have before we get started. So with that said, Kathy, I'll push it to your first slide and it's over to you.
Thank you, Sally, and thank you everyone for joining today. I trust that you're being here, being in this virtual space or in this physical space means that this issue of race and how we deal with it in our everyday lives and our everyday practice is of some significance to you. My hope today is that we would lean in. I have 4 objectives, as it were, for today. One, I want to create awareness about race. I hope that we become uncomfortable. And I say we become uncomfortable because I realize that change, which is the ultimate goal, I realize that change doesn't always take place in an environment of comfort. From my experience in life, we change our shoes when they hurt our feet, or we've changed our social, physical environment. We change our clothes with some cue. Either we need to get out of the clothes we're in because we are changing something about our environment, or maybe they're smelly or something. But change happens when we become uncomfortable in our present situation. There's this saying that we don't change it if it's not broken, right? And so it's on that premise that I say my goal for today is to create discomfort in us, because my ultimate goal for today is to push us towards change. And I hope in all of today that even though this environment oftentimes doesn't lend itself well to participation, I hope that we can all participate in today. So throughout the course of this presentation, write your questions down and send it. At the very end of the presentation, I give you opportunities. And through Sally as well, through CASW, you can send questions or you can connect with me through email if you have ongoing questions, things we didn't get around to. So let's go. I want to start by telling you a story, because at the heart, I'm a great storyteller. But I want to tell you a story. I'm Black. Seriously. I am Black. Not just through those blackface, really Black. And I say that, and that becomes important for us as we talk about race in our practice. And I say that because I want to be able to gauge what happens when I say to you, I'm Black. What does that do for you? Maybe, because I can't see you all, maybe you're not Black. Maybe you're not racialized. Maybe you're a white person. What does my identification of being Black do for you? I've often been told, why do we have to talk about race? We are just humans, and we all don't. We all share the same humanity. Why do we talk about race? Why is that important? I tell people I'm Black. I'm an academic. And a few years ago, one of my students walked into my office, and if you've read my book, you would see, I think, this story in there. A student walked into my office. Well, she didn't really walk in. I invited her in, seeing her in the hallway. She hadn't submitted her assignments for some time. It was past due. And seeing her in the hallway, I called her into my office and said, hey, what's happening? She said, well, I haven't come to you because I find you intimidating and unapproachable. And I thought, whoa, okay. We're moving fast on this. Normally I get those in student evaluations, but for somebody to give it to me in my face, it's like, whoa, okay. So I put my best social worker voice on. And I said, tell me more. And she said, well, you're tall and you're skinny and you have a dry sense of humor that's more acceptable in men. I said, okay, that's interesting. And then I asked, well, there is another professor across the hall from me. She's taller than I am. She's skinnier than I am. Do you also find her to be intimidating and unapproachable? She said, no, but you have to remember you're Black. And I said, okay. what you're saying to me is, before I enter a space, my Blackness tells a story. In white space, and I characterize Canada as white space, and understand my use of whiteness as an ideology, as a way of thinking and being, not just whiteness in the color of one's skin. But within white space, Blackness becomes clearly defined. And I often say, and I hear this often from racialized people, I became Black. I became Black once I entered white space. It's, as an immigrant woman, for me, I was always Black. It's just that my Blackness never defined me until I entered white space. Then, before I am woman, I am Black. I'm a Black woman. I'm the Black professor. I'm the Black co-worker. I'm the Black mother. And so Blackness then defines me, as it would the Filipino woman, the Asian woman, the Chinese woman, the Indian woman. Race becomes that defining element within white space. And so race becomes important. I'll tell you another story. A few weeks ago, I was doing a radio broadcast in a panel. No, more than a few weeks ago. This was in the wake of the Christchurch shooting that I hope we are all familiar with. And in the wake of Christchurch, I was invited into a panel to talk about race, issues of tolerance. And on this panel next to me was a white man. And one of the arguments he put forward as he addressed me was, I just see you as an individual. That sounds very progressive. He said, you are just an individual, just like me. We are all individuals. I do not see, he said, I do not see when I look at you, woman or race, I see an individual. And so we had a very courageous discourse on that topic. But why am I telling you these stories? I'm telling you these stories because in our workplace, in our life, until this is an African saying that I really appreciate, until the lion tells his side of the story, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. How do we begin to tell stories in our practice? And we ask ourselves, whose stories get told? Whose voices become magnified? How do we hold the stories of racialized others in our practice? And how do we amplify those voices? Those become important considerations for us, because oftentimes, depending on one, and I asked the question very early on to determine who's my audience. I asked the question of who my audience is because, and most of you are in frontline work. One of the realities of living and working in Canada is that you will always come in touch with difference. You are highly likely to come in touch with difference. And if you're working frontline, it means that the community you're serving, even if the majority of your community may look like you, whatever you look like, you will have a subset of your community that looks different. And so, how do we tell the story of those who are different from our reality? Are those stories important? More importantly, how do those stories make it in to the service we engage in? Race matters in our practice because equity is our goal. Remember when I started, I said the goal of today is to push us towards change. And oftentimes we don't change things if they're not broken. Depending on who we are, our social location in our practice, there's no need to change because the system works for us. But understand that the system does not work for everyone. And as social workers, those of us in a value profession, those of us who are called, I think social work is one of the noblest professions in life. Hence, I'm in it. Hence, you're in it. I think you share the same view. But because we are in this profession where values are key, it's important for us, and equity, social justice, those notions of equity and social justice, because those are key, they are foundational to our profession, race matters. Because race is a social justice issue. Because race is an equity issue. So, again, it's not enough to ask, does our system work? We must ask, for whom does our system work? Because change is imperative. Our system does not work for everyone. Therefore, change is imperative. We must be able to ask the questions of our system if we truly believe that we live and work in a system that's just. Why is it just for some and justifiable for others? If our system is inequitable, it means that those who are living with inequity, our system becomes justifiable for them. We live in a two-tiered world, a two-tiered system of just and justifiable. And because we live in that system, change must be an imperative. Just and justifiable does not equate to equity. So how? How do we experience difference? So I go back to the story I started with my friend. His name was Dennis. And Dennis said to me at the end of our broadcast that he couldn't call me Black because to call me Black, Dennis said, was racist. And I thought, oh, you are so precious. Because we had this great opportunity to air what would be the sentiments of many, this fear of identifying difference. And so I often ask people, when you see an orchid, I love flowers. So when I see an orchid, when you see an orchid or any flower, do you appreciate the difference? Or maybe flowers aren't your thing. Maybe it's something else. Can you appreciate the difference between two? Maybe it's cars. The blue car or the Jaguar as opposed to the Audi, or the Nissan as opposed to the Kia. We can appreciate those differences. But when it comes to people, we have a harder time identifying the difference. Part of that is our political correctness in our society. I think we've overcorrected on some things. So it makes us really shy to talk about difference. And so I get things like a progressive stance would be color blindness. I don't see color, I just see people. Here's what you're doing when you're not seeing color. Because remember, I'm Black. I'm really Black. And many other things too, but I'm Black. When you don't see color, you've erased a huge part of my identity. When we choose not to see color, and it's a choice, seeing or not seeing, it's a choice. We are engaging in a process of erasure. It's like we have a pencil with a really great eraser, and we are just choosing to erase parts of people's identities. So the question is not whether we see or don't see. It's about how we acknowledge and what do we do with difference. It is not the fact that I am different or that the person with whom you're working is different. What does that mean? What does that difference mean? And so for many of us, and I ask you to think about and write about what's your encounter with difference? How did you begin to encounter difference in your workplace, in the wider society? What frames your own understanding of difference? That really becomes important for us. We have these stereotypes in society that whether we acknowledge it or not, we call it implicit bias. They feed somewhere in the background. It's like a computer that's always, it has stuff stored in the background that we aren't even aware of, but it's draining our battery, right? And so we have these things going on in the background for us that if we don't pull them to the fore, if we are not conscious about them, they're still operational, we just aren't conscious. What informs your thinking and your encounters with race? I told you my own experience in terms of understanding myself as a racial being. I grew up in a country where race really wasn't an issue. My Blackness wasn't an issue because everybody was Black. Well, most. There were other issues, level of education, socioeconomic standard, gender. But race wasn't one of those. But when I walked into this space, suddenly race became the issue for me. And then that intersects with all the other variables, being Black and being woman, being Black and being my socioeconomic status. So all those other issues became implicated, but they are all mediated through this lens of race. So how do we value difference, and how do we come to this place of how did we get the values we ascribe to difference? So stereotypically, we know, quote unquote, that Black people are lazy, that Asian people are computer whiz, that Filipino people are good for being nannies. We have these stereotypes that's going around in our society that helps to inform what we think about the person who's in front of us, how we serve them or don't serve them, the attitude we first put forward when we see difference. Tell you, I like to tell stories. I was needing housing for a family in our region recently enough. I called someone in a community who engages in refugee housing. We had a great conversation on the phone, absolutely wonderful conversation. We ended our conversation on a positive note, and we ended our conversation with a promise that I will attend a function later on in that month, and that we will meet face to face. And there we did. I attended the function, we met face to face. I approached the gentleman and I introduced myself. And he said, "Oh, I didn't realize you were Black. You didn't sound Black on the phone." What did that do for him? Blackness doesn't have a voice, a sound. But in an instant, it changed his approach to me, because what he understood me to be on the phone before he saw me, and then what he saw were two very different things. I've often been asked things like, "Do you know this person in the cafeteria staff?" Constantly. Or, "Where's the garbage?" Not because I'm a professor, but because in people's minds, I'm supposed to occupy a particular role in society. The stereotypes with which we grow up, understanding who's who and who should be where, what role should you perform. But a lot of how we value difference, how we talk about difference, how we experience difference is based on fear. Fear of the unknown. And so one of the things I started again by saying, I'm really Black, not just Trudeau's blackface. If you are following up on social media, you would know Trudeau, the whole set of pictures about Trudeau donning blackface a few years ago. And I've had people say to me, "But Trudeau is not racist, he's a good man." And we are afraid of being labeled the racist. Goodness and racism are not the same. We can be good racist people. Racism are a set of actions. And oftentimes, there are a set of actions that we go way back in history. They're generational. They're informed by generations of thought and actions. And it really has very little to do with how good we are. Because we thrive on this myth nationally, our national identities based on this myth of Canada the good. And don't get me wrong, I'm not bashing Canada. Canada is good. Doesn't mean we don't have racism. It doesn't mean we are perpetuators of racism. Let's separate racism from goodness. Let's identify in each of ourselves the inner racist. I like to say, and this really is dependent on where you fall with Trump. And we like to point fingers over the border. We can always find something wrong with Trump. I say, let's identify the inner Trump in all of us, the small t's, right? Because it's there. Overcoming fear. Our courage to change must be greater than our fear of being hurt. Our courage to change must be greater than our fear of being hurt. And oftentimes we do not take action. We won't ask simple questions because we are afraid of how we are going to be perceived. And so overcoming that fear has to do with our courage for change, but also sitting with discomfort. We've been trained often that if something's uncomfortable, we change it. We deal with it. We don't sit with it. So we change our clothes because it's smelly. And we change our shoes because it hurts our feet. We need to learn how to sit with discomfort. One of my coworkers said to me some time ago, as I dared to raise this issue of race and racism in our department, she became really upset by this. And she said, now we are all walking on eggshells because of you. I'm the only Black woman in my department. We are now walking on eggshells because of you. Why, she said, why can't we go back to how it used to be? Going back to how it used to be is not really an option. Discomfort, sitting with discomfort. My response to her was, welcome to my world, where I walk on eggshells. But let's be thoughtful about this. If we are to engage in changing our social imaginary, if we are to engage in changing our racial landscape, we must be able to sit with the discomfort, because I guarantee you, talking about race, whether it be within our families, in our workplaces, in society at large, talking about race is not comfortable. We must be able to sit with the discomfort. I talk about if you're in an agency, in a university, wherever you are, we have come to realize that equity, diversity, and inclusions are the new flavors of the month. I call them flavors of the month. We've talked about Indigenous as a flavor. as though it were a flavor. Let's move on to the next new thing. And so it's always moving on to the new thing. But what I also know from my work is that many of our institutions, agencies, and us as individuals, we really don't know what to do. We've established equity, diversity, and inclusion offices. Almost every institution, agency has an equity officer. But what are we doing? We are still challenged on that. And so as we march further towards EDI, we must recognize some of the challenges embedded within this notion of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so I advocate this, I see the progression of EDI. Diversity is a fact. It's a fact of who we are. It doesn't tell us anything. Our diverse agencies are diverse, our client serving groups are diverse. That tells us that's a fact. It doesn't tell us how they're included, right? That we have a 20% racialized population in our workplace doesn't tell us how that 20% is truly included in our workplace. So we progress towards inclusion. But even in our progression towards inclusion, we have to realize that there are challenges with inclusion. As it is, inclusion remains a power position. Inclusion remains governed by whiteness. And go back to my concept of whiteness, ideology. Who gets to frame inclusion? It's still governed by whiteness. Who gets in, who's included in these boundaries, and who remains excluded, and how? It's still governed by whiteness. And so we must progress beyond inclusion. So what? So what? What we know is that presence is not participation. Because you have a client base that's different, racially different, because you have workers, because you have students who are racially different in your agency or organization, it does not mean they are equally participating or they are participating equitably. So presence is not participation. Presence is not representation. And so I go back to my experience as an academic, and I say that one of the things I tell students often is I understand their discomfort, and oftentimes I understand their concern, because many of our students go to institutions where they have never seen this color on that side of the classroom. And so to now engage with difference on the other side of the classroom throws them off a bit. Representation. Ask yourselves in your workplaces, how is race represented? How is race represented in your agency, your employees, as opposed to who you're serving? How is race represented in your classrooms? beyond the question of participation and representation, we must ask the question of how do we support difference in our practice? Difference in terms of how are we supporting our clientele that's different, our students that's different, our workers, our employees that's different. Because it's one thing to have difference, what we do with it is a completely different issue. So we must be asking those questions. Making a space for race in our workplace, in our practice, needs intervention at multiple levels. Start with self. Our self is the first level of intervention. And I'll go through all of these. I'm really trying my best to go faster because I know I want to leave some time for discussion, right? We all bring baggage. We all bring baggage. We fool ourselves if we think, and this is going back to the implicit bias. We fool ourselves if we think we come to the table with no baggage. So first, identify your baggage. Whose bag is that? Think about the airport carousel. Whose bag is that? Identify your baggage. What are you bringing to this table of race in your workplace? Be the change you want to see. We can't hope to change our world if we aren't willing to confront ourselves. We have no control over our world, and to understand that our world and our systems, they are made up of individuals just like you. So you be the change you want to see. Institutionally, oftentimes what we are doing in our institutions, in our agencies, as we talk about race and making space for race, it's like moving furniture around. We move one chair, we move a couch, the sofa, we put same room. We are just manipulating furniture. So how do we move beyond the manipulation of furniture in one room? I say we need to create spaces, safe and brave spaces, right? In our workplace, places that call us outside of our comfort zone, but that spaces that maintain respect. And we need to engage in dangerous discourses. We need to have those conversations. They're uncomfortable, but let's have them, because we are not moving the lever. We are not moving anything if we can't begin to talk. So let's stop moving furniture around in our agencies, in our institutions, in our spheres of influence, and let's break some walls. Because as we think about making space, the space that we currently occupy does not fit for everyone. It may be comfortable space for the majority, but we have a marginalized minority, and it doesn't work for everyone. So here we are. Questions and discussions, and Sally is going to feed me with questions as they come in. But I also have some people in the room, in my physical space, and I wonder if you have questions as well. Well,
We could get started with some questions from the audience, and then I can check back in to see if you have any from your room too.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
The questions that I have so far are really, it's interesting. I think people are really asking you for advice, and I hope that's okay. And the first one is very interesting, and they say, I'm a person of color, and I often struggle with trying to challenge, or at the very least, to bring up race, or maybe even just identify blind spots that colleagues have in their behavior. This has been an amazing presentation, but would you have any practical tips, like literal conversation starters?
Yes. So I'm just going to repeat the question for those who are physically with me because they can't hear. And the question is one from somebody who's racialized and wanting some suggestions about bringing up race with others who are not racialized. And I say, there are two things I say about this. One, we as racialized bodies, we also live with that factor of fear, right? Because we are often labeled, especially as it relates to race, around we are aggressive when we bring this issue up. And so we have to deal with our own fear factor. The other thing I encourage racialized people to hold in mind is that this notion of white fragility, where whiteness becomes offended or hurt because we raise issues of race, we as racialized people are not the protectors of white fragility. We have our own baggage to carry to take on the baggage of white folk who refuse to carry their own load. So with that, and I know those are somewhat radical positions, but it doesn't help us as racialized people in terms of dealing with some of the trauma associated with living within a white space. So how do we raise issues of race? How do we challenge our white colleagues? There are there are many approaches, but two I want to bring our attention to. One is the possibility of calling in. So we have this call in or call out, and a lot of what we see in the media is about calling out. Calling in, maybe it's the one-on-one. Maybe it's the saying to a white colleague, hey, can I talk to you? When you said X, this is the impact. Did you mean this? And one of the realities about privilege, whether we want to view it as white privilege, ableism, all those privileges, what they come with is huge blinders. And oftentimes, people who live with privilege cannot see. It then becomes, it falls on us, which is an unfortunate thing, to help people to remove blinders. And so it may be in the one-on-one, it may be in the group, call in, hey, can we talk about this? Because this, and maybe start with the self, this is what it's doing to me. When you say this, when you behave in this way, you may not be seeing the racism tied to it. But here's my experience of it. The second strategy is to call out. And I say use call out very judiciously, because calling out isn't often a transformative space. And what we want to do is we want change. Calling out often doesn't lead to transformation in the space that we wanted or with the person that we wanted. But calling out is effective, especially when you see there is no hope for change in that situation. You call it out. But know that whether you call in or you call out, it takes a toll on you. So here's the other strategy. You ask yourself, what are the supports in my world? Oftentimes we can't depend on our system to create supports for us because our system is okay. So ask yourself, what are the supports in my world that you can create to deal with the trauma you're experiencing, whether you call in or you call out? Hope that helps.
I also have the flip side question too. I've got a number of questions from white folks that are sort of the opposite question. So someone says, I'm a white man, and sometimes I see people in my workplace being less than inclusive, often in the presence of one of our friends who is Black, but she doesn't seem to notice or mind, at least outwardly. I always wonder if it's my role to say something, or would that be seen as overstepping or being a white knight?
Okay, so here's this question from a white person, a white male, who says he sees the racism, but often he questions if he were to walk into that, would he be the white savior, the white knight? And I say, allyship is key. We need, here's one of the other strategies I've used, and I'll answer both questions. So the first question and this one. I've often had white allies when I know I become invisible, and it's really strange how the visible minority becomes invisible, but it happens. In my workplace, when often I become invisible, because what I say isn't heard. When a white person says it, it's heard. So what I would do oftentimes, and now you know, I will scribble what I want to say and hand it to one of my white colleagues and let them say it. Because I know when they say it, it's going to be heard. So it really depends on what is the issue at hand, and is the issue more important? If the issue is more important, and I know that my presence, my Blackness is going to muffle the sound of the issue, I will let one of my white colleagues say it. Unfortunate, but it's a strategy. As a white person, one of the greatest things you can do is allyship. When I say this to my students often, when you stand up against racism, when you stand up against homophobia, against xenophobia, against any of these ills of society, you are not standing up for, when you stand up against racism, you're not standing up for me as a Black person. You're standing up for humanity. And so I say, yes, you add voice. You add, your strength is going to amplify the voices of those who are otherwise marginalized. So as a white person, when you observe racism, here's the kicker in all of this. There's no neutral position. Okay? Neutrality is not a thing. When people, going back to this fear of being labeled racist, I say determine your propensity for racism by the efforts you're engaging in to end racism. If you are not engaging in efforts to end racism, then you can answer the question yourself about how racist you are. There is no neutral position. To do nothing, as a white person, a white male, I say allyship works. So please stand up and call it out.
I think that's probably a very powerful answer for a lot of people in the audience, because I mean that I just read the one question, but there was many versions of that question, I have to say, that came in. We have 4 or 5 minutes left. Is there a question from your folks that are there?
Any questions here? My folks are shy. They say no.
Okay. I have, so this might be this is very complex. This might be one of the last ones that I ask you. Actually, maybe 1 or 2 more. But, and the person identifies that there's not even really a question in it. I think they just want you to think about it. And they say, I'm white. I have Indigenous colleagues. We often have land acknowledgements, blanket exercises, and she says, etc. But I find this stuff is led by the senior management and includes the staff and design, but not always. I always wonder what my Indigenous colleagues would actually like to happen or how they would like to be treated, so I want to ask them directly, but I also don't want to put them in a position to have to speak for their whole community or tokenize. It's so complex, I don't even know if I have a real question, !
Okay. So this I'm repeating for the sake of my colleagues in the room. And so this question is around, we have programs and activities and all of that being planned by organizations, and we have Indigenous colleagues, and how are their voices even reflected in what has gone on, but you don't want to become a token as a white person by raising these issues. And so here's what I say on tokenism. I don't mind being a token as long as it leaves the door open, right? If for me personally, if you are using me as a token, use me as a door opener. Right? I think it's it's not a question, but it's a real issue in our society that we often have management that's planning, because they're mandated, because we're moving towards EDI. We have all of these things that's taking place around equity and inclusion and decolonization without the voices of those who are impacted. Yes, it's problematic. And yes, I think this is where, again, our allyship, because you're absolutely right, whoever put this question forward, you're absolutely right in that you do not want to become in this case, let's use the word, the white savior again for Indigenous people or racialized people. This is, again, where allyship comes in. Don't underestimate the value of your voice. You, as a white male, you may have more currency in your agency, in your organization, to create that change. And here's the other thing I find. Well-meaning folks may not even have considered it. They may not even have considered that the voices of the people for whom they're planning needs to be included. And so, again, we can't assume that people have considered, because privilege often doesn't see things. That for those who live with oppression are screaming. Privilege allows us not to see or hear. And so when you are walking in a privileged position, it's useful if you can echo the voices of those who are otherwise unheard.
So we're technically over time, but I have, I want to ask one more question just because it feels just like a really important one. And I'm sorry to the audience if I wasn't able to get to your questions, just for time constraints. But there's, I believe, a young woman who says, I am an African American studying in Canada. What can I do if I'm dealing with racial discrimination in academia where administrators and faculty staff have normalized professors' oppression of students?
Yeah. That's a challenging one. So the question is, this is from an African-American woman who's studying in Canada, and she's asking the question of what can she do where the oppression of racialized students are normalized in the institution. And academic institutions are no different from the rest of society, and academic institutions are very different from the rest of society. I had this discussion this morning as we plan for a huge event in the next 2 days at my university, the University of Waterloo. We are having a 2-day conference called Conversaction, where it focuses on action and conversation related to race and racism. The reality is our institutions, we go back to the earlier discussion that our institutions are safe places for the majority of folks. And so because they are safe spaces for the majority of folks, it becomes much more difficult. Oppression is seen much less. You're absolutely right. It's normalized. So what do? We continue to fight, knowing that there are many others who have fought so that we can be in these institutions. We will not go silently. Allyship. Who are your allies? Find faculty, student allies, and work with your allies to dismantle systems. Our systems are not going to they're not going to wake up. People who uphold our systems are not going to wake up one day and say, oh, yeah, we need to change this. Frederick Douglass, many of you may be familiar with him. He was a Black activist in the US. He said, I'm butchering what he said actually. He said, change will not happen just like that. He said, we think if we think we can have good crops without tilling the soil, he said, that's foolish thinking. Power concedes nothing. It never has and it never will. That's his perspective. But one that I share, the more I do this race work. Power and power holders must see the need to change. It falls on us and those of us who are allies, who walk in allyship, to challenge our systems. And as a student, that's a hard road to take because you are already dealing with all the other burdens of just being a student to add racial oppression onto it. One, I say, what are your systems of support? Almost every institution has an association for Black students or so on. Not that they all work, but find those systems that's within your institution that's designed to support and work through them. But I want to encourage you and at the same time maybe remind you that change isn't going to come easily. And as racialized people, we know that history tells us that we must work twice as hard to get half as far. But we must, because we're working not only for ourselves, we're working for the generations behind us.
Well, it's 12:07, so technically we've gone over, but I think it was important to do so. So before I give my thanks on behalf of CSW and CSWE, we're getting lots of messages of thanks from the audience. I just want to read one that just came in, and someone says, "Thank you to Dr. Hogarth. Your words are healing me. I'm a woman of color and I've been racialized throughout my life. I am looking forward to reading more from your book." So that's just one, and I will send all the rest of them to you. So that is the end of our time. I have to say a huge thank you to you, Kathy, to Dr. Hogarth, for sharing your expertise, for being willing to talk so candidly and personally, I think, too, while also sharing her academic expertise on a topic that doesn't get nearly enough space. And thank you to the audience for your really engaging participation and your great questions. And I hope to see everyone at the next webinar.
So thank you, everyone. And if you want to connect with me, my email is there on the slides, or you can also feel free to connect through Sally. Thank you, everyone.
Perfect. Okay, take care.
Yeah, bye.